reveal kind of revolutionary future that was imminent in the present. So they drew on these kind of existing, so the second context in which this set of ideas emerged, in other words, was this kind of inheritance from the pre-existing Soviet media that had had a similar revolutionary time. The thaw was a period of sort of great high levels of belief and enthusiasm among Soviet intellectuals. This was not yet a period of disillusionment for most elites, particularly artistic elites. It was when they were being given a chance to become re-engaged in the revolutionary project, having been repressed under Stalin. This criticism of Stalin and kind of opening up of the arts gave them a chance to be kind of newly engaged in building socialism in a way that they felt would be authentic and improved over that which they'd seen in the previous 30 years of Soviet history. So you have this sort of attempt to draw on all kinds of different resources from the past to help build a new Soviet future through the visions of these intellectuals. And the third context that we need to understand these ideas in is not Soviet at all, but that of U.S. Intellectuals and to some extent the U.S. government, and particularly U.S. television network executives in the same period or about a decade earlier, since television developed more rapidly here. These ideas are very widespread, similar ideas about transparency and immediacy and the stripping away of corruption of television that would reveal truth. I see my Americanist colleague rolling her eyes. Right? We've all become disillusioned with these kind of utopian ideas. But the idea that television would transport us, would allow viewers to be virtually transported to the scene of political meetings, for example, sort of stripping away the possibilities for political corruption, and that this sort of transcendent vision and transparency of television would allow television to be very different than the preceding media, radio and film, which were seen as corrupted by commercialism. So television was going to have this new kind of enlightening and sort of transparency-granting positive impact on American democracy. And much like in the Soviet Union after World War II in the United States, there was this sort of large desire to perfect the project that they had commenced, right? The project itself had been validated by victory in World War II, and now here, with this new media technology that was kind of had emerged before the war, but became particularly sort of began to develop only after the war because of the kind of obviously delays of the war. The desire for this technology to help kind of realize these ambitious visions of what the American project or the Soviet one could, bring to the world and indeed show the world. So it's important to keep in mind the connections between the fact that these ideas, although they have all these specific Soviet roots that seem very much tied to kind of revolutionary utopian ideas about building communism and overcoming all human conflict, nonetheless they're also really rooted in, are also highly present in the United States in the late 40s, early 50s. And as commercial television kind of triumphs in ratings, they are gradually kind of abandoned the idea of live spectaculars. If any of you watch 30 Rock, they still make jokes about this because it's NBC in particular that really promotes these ideas. And 30 Rock is a television show on the present set in NBC. And they still have these ideas about sort of television spectaculars. So it'll be live and it'll be truly amazing. It'll draw viewers. In any case, they still make fun of this kind of history of NBC as the place where this was most broadly promoted. So this particular view of television as kind of bringing a transparent form of penetrating new form of vision lasted a lot longer in the Soviet Union than it did in the United States for what might seem to be pretty obvious reasons, right? The idea that media were supposed to be enlightening, was state-controlled. So this enlightening kind of intellectual-led vision of what media were for was able to survive much longer in the Soviet Union than it could in the United States, where sort of commercial pressures quickly eroded the idea. I think people mostly don't care, it turns out, whether they're watching film fiction or a live drama, right? You're watching at the same moment. No one really, it turns out, cares in terms of audiences. So anyway, this vision lasted much longer in the Soviet Union. And this chapter within my dissertation kind of sets up the ongoing interest in the power of kind of unpredictable, unscripted, spontaneous play of various kinds on Soviet television, even after live television comes to an end. It's because there, too, as soon as they get the ability to do videotape or even film, they also abandon live broadcasting because it's inconvenient, it's dangerous for those who do it, it's problematic for any kind of censored television any time and place. But nonetheless, Soviet television producers within this kind of elite core in Moscow continued to be committed to these ideas and talk about them and write about them. And the main guy who I talked about in the paper, Vladimir Sabak, this sort of television critic from the late 50s, continues to be quoted in prominent places all the way through the late 80s. And to some extent, he's still studied in journalism schools there, and people in television and radio departments. So it sets up this abiding interest that then kind of changes meaning, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. They continue to kind of draw on these ideas of play and new vision in shows, particular kind of game shows and contest shows that are focused on uncertainty and uncertain outcomes. So they have a lot of shows where the outcome is unknown, even though it's pre-taped, right? You still get the experience of kind of uncertainty and contest throughout the show. And many of these shows then go on during Perestroika under Gorbachev to kind of become important political forums. You see them kind of practicing, and the show that we'll look at in a minute does this, kind of practicing forms of live debate and live broadcasting without it actually being live. They have all this live-looking camera work, the cameraman's right in there, and they're kind of acting as though it's live television without it really being live during the 1970s in particular. And then all those forms and genres that they kind of create to emphasize these qualities turn into political discussion programs in the late 1980s, and then some of them are just still on the air today because that kind of genre isn't necessarily linked to teleological Marxism-Leninism or the arrival of communism, right? It's just a game show or a variety show or whatever, musical contest like American Idol. They had one of those. So the question for me kind of going forward is both for this short-term conference paper that I must deliver and for the longer-term kind of direction and future of this project, which in some ways is probably more interesting to people who work on media than it is to people who work on Russian history. Sort of what is the question, how is all of this relevant to media everywhere, to our sort of theoretical understanding of how media change and relate to one another, or to media in the present, right? How does this sort of television history that's becoming, to some extent, more discrete from television is no longer the sort of main bugaboo in our discussions of media, now it's the internet and digital games and that kind of thing. Anyway, so what does this tell us about any of that? And to talk about that, I was struck by the relevance of a particular sort of theoretical approach from our until very recently colleague Richard Gruson and his colleague Jay Bolter that characterized contemporary digital media specifically, but also to some extent all of Western media since the Renaissance, as characterized by something that they call remediation. And this concept has a couple of dimensions. The first is that the claim that all Western media, since at least the Renaissance, have sort of refashioned and reformed one another. So each subsequent media has borrowed techniques from and drawn on the one before. It's a very natural kind of historical claim. And second, that they do so by at once kind of promising a more immediate and intense sort of experience of some sort of immediate or authentic experience, and at the same time, kind of paradoxically, and as a result of this promise of reform and greater immediacy, by making us more aware of the medium as a medium. So they call this the double logic of remediation, and talk about how new media in particular, or sort of more extremely so than previous media, they argue, but nonetheless, all previous media kind of oscillate between immediacy and hyper-immediacy, so hyper-awareness of the kind of medium as a medium itself. And this applies very directly and kind of obviously to Soviet television as well. And I'm just going to pass around a picture that, just only had one picture, so I didn't bother putting it on PowerPoint, but in any case, a photograph of how Soviet television in the early years was often shot. And it's a picture of a newsreader, so like a sort of female news anchor. They were mostly female before kind of the late 1950s. And still there was always a man and a woman delivering Soviet news on the set. And it's a photograph where it's shot from behind the main camera, so you can see the cameras in the foreground. This is a very typical image of Soviet television sets, where they would often represent the equipment in the photo, right, to show you the mediation of the very immediate experience of having this woman talking in your living room, right, which was very novel and exciting, obviously, for people who were just beginning to get television pictures from the late 50s as well. So this kind of oscillation between immediacy and hypermediacy, the promise that television would finally achieve what previous media had aimed at but not succeeded in doing by being in the home, by being even more immediate, by being live,